Hey there everybody, my name's the Worldsmith, and I realized as I was looking through my first two videos that I might have gotten a bit ahead of myself. I've been talking about world building tasks, but I've not sat down yet to define it. Most people have an idea of what that is, but I'd like to cover some groundwork before we go any further. On top of that, I also want to make sure that I convey just how important this sort of process is. It really lays a lot of important facts down before you move further in your story, and it can really help smooth out the process of writing a book. Now, let's go on ahead and get into it then. Well, our first thing, like I said, is what is world building? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory in the word. It's pretty obvious. World building is the process of building a world. Now, even though the term is pretty straightforward, there's quite a bit more involved under that umbrella than one might suspect at first. So for instance, when you think of world building, there is the literal, I have to understand what the world looks like. In the world of fantasy, we generally like having world maps, or at least maps of the area where the story is taking place. That is, at its most fundamental level, a literal world building. You're establishing where are the mountains, where are the forests, where are the streams, where are the cities, who lives in the world, things like that. That is surface level. That is, of course, an important part of the process, and it can be very complicated depending on how realistic you want things to be and how believable they must be for your preferences, and how large the world is and how detailed the map is. I can go on, but I won't for your sake. Beyond just the first level of actual building the world, there are many things beyond that, going down to really often ridiculous depths. But let's start with something that's just more of a second tier issue, defining what lives in the world. This is not directly world building in the sense of the physical landscape, but it's what populates that landscape. Is the landscape something very similar to our world? Along the lines of what you might see in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire saga. There's not very much out there that's beyond the scope of understanding for the normal human world. Other than the seasons and a little bit of magic, it's essentially the same world. You know, White Walkers / others notwithstanding. Now, what do I mean by who lives in the world? Well, normally you're going to have at least humans, something that your audience can relate to. But, you go with the typical lineup of fantasy races. You'll have your dwarves, your elves, your hobbits, and or halflings, depending on your preferred term, and then the orcs. But there's so much more you can go along with it. When you think about it, a lot of people do this as well. So sometimes they'll subdivide the races. So you'll have night elves or dark elves. You'll have high elves or blood elves. There might be some other general evil, considered to be evil race, like the dwarves. Not the dwarves. Well, some people consider dwarves to be evil, actually. It's kind of interesting. But anyway. But like the orcs, so you might have World of Warcraft's Worgen. There's all kinds of different options that you could look at for what that looks like. But the point is, you have to define what lives in your world. And that also goes beyond the sentient races, which might even be considered a third tier issue. Do you just have a standard run-of-the-mill, this is Earth's creature set? Do you have something completely replacing that? Something like you would see in Avatar: The Last Airbender. Almost every creature we see in the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender is some amalgamation of two things in some way or another. Very rarely is something actually just a normal thing, because they have a whole different world, and that's part of the way they wanted to communicate that to you and to us, I suppose. But there's also a more common thing done in more fantasies where it's a additional sort of approach to the creatures of a world. That would be, you have your standard wolves and deer and whales and sharks and all this other stuff, but they'll add more. So you'll see dragons. Depending on whether you view a fairy as an animal or a sentient race, you might have a fairy. Trolls. Again, it all depends on intelligence level assigned to the creature, but then you could have something that's a mixture of two things, like you would do in Avatar: The Last Airbender, or just a bigger version of a thing. So you might have a massive bear that was bigger than any polar or Kodiak grizzly. just for instance. And that's just getting into the creatures of a world. We're not done yet. We've already covered magic in a previous video. We're going to cover it again some more, but that's an aspect of the fundamental laws of a world. And that's just one part of it. So you could think, well, if magic is a part of the fundamental fabric of a fantasy world, is gravity the same? It's a story. You can change that if you want. I generally advise to keep with natural law to some extent, so people aren't having to relearn everything to read your story. But if you're creative enough and you can address it well enough, you could change something like that and get away with it. Sci-Fi likes doing this with alien planets, but people expect that of alien planets. So maybe the north isn't cold. Maybe the north is hot, and the area near the center of the given planet is colder. Now, you have to have an interesting celestial situation to make that work, but there's no reason why it couldn't be that way. So you kind of get my point. There's a lot of variance in how you could make this sort of situation work in what world building is and what's involved in the task. And it goes even further. What political systems are you looking at having? Which countries are there, and what do their borders look like? What particular politics do those realms employ? Are they empire? Are they feudal? Are they democratic or republic or democratic republic? Are they tribal? And you have to sort those things out for some degree of consistency and continuity. What does the average life of a normal person in a given country look like? Are we talking about a very developed, advanced civilization in your fantasy setting where magic is so advanced that it's essentially brought them to live in a world similar to the one that we live in, where the average person isn't having to go work to get food out of the ground or out of the forest, but they work and make money and pay for food, which has happened at all levels of society. But if the average person's doing that, then the average person's no longer a farmer. They've passed some sort of industrial revolution era. Are they in an industrial revolution era? Are they in an ancient era or a medieval era? And you have to decide their level of technology. What does the technology look like? Do they pursue the mundane sciences of our world in the same way, with magic being a thing that exists? If they do, what do they find, and how does it intermingle with your magic? That's just going into some political stuff. You can further go into the nature of the individual people's culture, and that's a really important thing to define. You want to understand your people's culture and how that impacts how they live their life, how it impacts their language, how it impacts their lingo, how it impacts their dress. You want to look at their religion, which is further impacted by their environment and their culture in the same way that culture is affected by environment. And religion can often affect culture as well as be influenced by culture. So that's another component. Are you dealing with an atheistic sort of elf, or are the elves very naturalistic and druidistic? You get the idea. As I keep going, there's more and more, and I keep on thinking of more as I go. I'm going to stop for now because the point is made. There is as much to world building as there is to the real world, and the level of detail you go into is entirely up to you. For me, I like going into the details because it's so much fun for me. But you might find it exasperating, or maybe you find it as fun as I do, and we can go through this world building journey by the small details together. So I've kind of further defined the general idea of world building, but I haven't yet conveyed the importance of it and why it matters. Now, just by describing it and further defining it, I've helped give a bit more importance to it. But it is really important that I further lay out what I mean by what importance this subject requires. Having a well-defined and completed world building scenario allows you to have a lot of problems that you will run into as you write solved ahead of time. There's any number of ways I could give examples for this, but it could be as simple as, all right, they're heading south from this city. What's south of that city? And you have to pluck a name out of your head, or you keep going to the same place. It's like, what, is there only one city to the south? Or you have the opposite problem. How many cities are there in the south, and how far away from each other are there? And then you have a lot to keep track of mentally, unless you have it at least written out, if not on a map. And then you can have some aid. And then you don't have to think about it. Now the problem has been solved before it even became a problem. What else? Well, there are other sorts of similar situations that are related to problems that you involve when you're writing, but really, it can reduce your overall creative load when you're writing. People among you who are writers like myself have encountered this, where you're writing and you just get to the point where it's exhausting. Maybe you aren't hit with a muse right now, so you're not able to write for 6 or 7 hours a day. Most people start to get really tired writing after an hour and a half to 2 hours. Some people push it to 3 or 4, but the point is the majority of us start getting really creatively exhausted at like about a 3-hour mark on average. Some people sooner, some people later. It depends. It also depends on how you're writing. So that 3 hours that you get per day, it's pretty important to get the most that you can out of it. And if you spend a lot of that time when you should be putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, then you'll find yourself not really wasting time, but using your time inefficiently while you write. You're trying to get words to paper, trying to lengthen the prose that you've gotten so far. And instead, you sat there and got tied down coming up with some new creature or figuring out where you're going next or trying to sort out how magic works in this particular scenario. Whereas if you have a well-defined system on the front end, that's not really a big issue. It might require a little bit of thought, but it doesn't turn into a 30 or 40-minute event, which slows you down and eats into your writing time. Generally, having a well-developed world allows you to have a far greater depth of consistency. And if you are more consistent, you can have more detail. And if you have more detail, you can be more consistent because you have everything written down. It's all defined. There's no concern about what this means or what that means and how they interact. You have it all written down. It's understood. It's referenceable. So you don't have to worry about stumbling over yourself as much going, oh, wait a minute, I just established 14 chapters ago this thing is in that place, but now I just said that it was in that other place. And now your editing is a nightmare. You can reduce your editing load that way, but you can also have a high level of consistency because those mistakes don't always get caught. But when you start having thousands and thousands or even hundreds of thousands, or God bless you if this is you, millions of eyes on your work, those discrepancies become far more obvious. And even if people are happy to read your work, they will still notice, and you would prefer that it had been perfect. Not that perfection is truly attainable, mind you. But if you can reduce it, that would be great. Now, another aspect that having a well-defined and well-supported and well-established world-building scenario set up, a good thing about that is it lets you have a focus on theme and plot and character development as you write, rather than on world building. This is very similar to reducing your creative load, but it's more about, instead of less distraction, it's more about more focus. It's the other side of the coin. So when you're writing your story, yeah, there'll be some character stuff established before you write, and there'll be some plot and theme stuff established before you write, but everyone knows that to some extent or another, the intricacies of writing will often lead a story off of the original plan, and you either have to find a way to wrap it back in or to alter the end plan to suit your live changes. And that's perfectly okay. That's part of the wonderful creative process we know is writing. But having other things get in the way of that can make that situation harder to track down, harder to make it flow and be as good and impressive as it could be. In the end, world building really boils down to one factor: a well-developed world, which is the result of careful and precise and detail-oriented world building, allows a more quality work in generally a shorter amount of time. So I guess that's really what it boils down to. World building is one of the secret pathways to quality. Now, that's all I really have to say. I really do hope that world building is well defined for you now and that you really understand just how important it is for you as a writer. And I hope now that any readers and watchers among us that are with us today really appreciate some of the details of work that go into a given world. and that can actually help enrich your experience as you enjoy your next work of fiction. Thank you guys for tuning in. Glad to have you. Hope to see you again soon. Farewell for now.